The phone rang at 3:17 in the morning, and with it came an ultimatum that could have broken a nation. A voice from far away, sharp and cold, ordered the reversal of every decision, the return of every contract, the surrender of sovereignty itself. 48 hours, that was the deadline. 2 days to choose between exile or humiliation, between submission or collapse. But in the stillness of that night, the leader of a small, landlocked country refused to bend. Ibrahim Traoré did not hear a command, he heard a challenge. What followed was no ordinary standoff. It was a clash between intimidation and dignity, between foreign dictates and African resolve. A president facing the shadow of regime change. A people refusing to kneel. A continent watching the clock tick, knowing that if one leader stood firm, the story of African sovereignty might never be told the same way again. Stay with us. This is not just a headline. It is a turning point that could redefine how history remembers Africa. Subscribe and walk with us through these 48 hours that tested a nation's soul. It began with a voice in the darkness, a command disguised as diplomacy. At 3:17 in the morning, the line crackled and the words fell like blades. Reverse every decision, restore the contracts, bring back the surveillance partnerships, or abandon your presidency. Or 48 hours. That was the time stamped upon the future of Burkina Faso. For any nation, such a demand would be heavy. For a small, landlocked country of 22 million, with no nuclear arsenal, no sprawling navy, no vast fortune of foreign reserves, it could have been fatal. Yet in that instant, Ibrahim Traoré did not tremble. The ultimatum did not sound like a death sentence. It sounded like a summons to clarity. He hung up the call and summoned his council. In the half-lit chamber of the presidency, his closest advisors assembled. The defense minister with eyes hardened by campaigns against insurgents, the intelligence chief whose files spoke of weeks of quiet surveillance from abroad, the foreign affairs advisor who already knew the outlines of coercion. The recording of Netanyahu's voice filled the room. Demands repeated. Deadlines confirmed. The silence that followed was thick, not of indecision but of recognition. "Sir, this is regime change," the defense minister said. "This is how superpowers announce their intentions before the storm." The intelligence chief nodded. He had traced the unusual activity, the satellites mapping movements, the cyber probes picking at government systems, the suspicious flows of money into networks known for orchestrating unrest. All the signs were there. What was missing was only the spark, and now it had been lit at 3:17 a.m. Traoré leaned against the map of Burkina Faso. Lines on paper that spoke of fragility. Borders drawn by colonial rulers, economies tied by dependency, a history too often marked by submission. Yet the map also spoke of soil tilled by calloused hands, of voices that refused silence, of a young generation that had seen enough of others deciding their fate. "We may be outnumbered, we may be outgunned," he told his council, "but we are not without power." Sometimes the refusal itself is power. Options were laid on the table. Step down and accept safe passage, hoping foreign approval would soften the exile. Or stand firm and prepare, not for tanks in the streets, but for other wars, digital, economic, psychological. Wars that strike the bank before the soldier, the rumor before the bullet. He made his choice without hesitation. Never, he said, rejecting the option of exile. The decision was not merely personal. It was a declaration that sovereignty was not for sale, not negotiable within a time limit set by another nation. From that moment, the hours became chapters of defiance. Midnight calls turned into morning briefings. The ultimatum was no longer a private order. It was becoming the crucible in which the country would test its resilience. By the end of the first day, Traoré had already made moves that no African leader had dared in decades. He reached for the secure phone, not to plead for rescue, but to weave a new web of resistance. Caracas, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, capitals across the world received his call. Not all offered promises of arms, but each one understood the symbolism. An African president was refusing to obey. Inside the palace, the weight of the ultimatum pressed heavy, yet it carried an energy too. Ministers whispered not of retreat, but of resolve. Staffers repeated the words they had heard. They think this is still 1960. They think African leaders still jump when white men whistle. As the deadline loomed, the meaning of those words began to extend beyond the palace walls. Rumors spread that a foreign power had demanded submission. The news would soon ignite the streets. But in this first act, the stage was set. A nation with no nuclear weapons, no great fleets, no guarantee of allies. yet with something more enduring: the refusal to kneel. The hours were ticking away, but the real question was no longer whether Traoré would yield. It was what would happen when an ultimatum met a people who refused to bow. The first 24 hours felt like a chess match where every move revealed the scale of the game. Netanyahu's second call came with sharper edges: step down voluntarily or be removed involuntarily. But if the words were cold, Traoré's response was colder still. I do not negotiate with extortionists. I do not bow to bullies. And I do not abandon my people because a foreign power threatens me. Then he ended the call, an act of defiance that echoed louder than any speech. Inside the crisis room, the tension sharpened. The defense minister warned, this is not policy pressure. This is regime change. The intelligence chief laid out patterns: satellite images crowding the skies, cyber intrusions on state servers, sudden transfers of funds into networks known for street agitation. The foreign affairs advisor whispered of a safer option: surrender and leave. But Traoré silenced the thought: never. Instead, he began building something unprecedented: a network of resistance. Secure lines crackled to life. In Caracas, Nicolás Maduro listened to the ultimatum replay and pledged solidarity. In Tehran, assurances of cyber defense arrived. In Moscow, military advisors stood ready. In Beijing, promises of alternative investments surfaced. It was a diplomatic marathon carried out under the shadow of a 48-hour clock. But the most decisive ally was not abroad. By morning, the ultimatum had leaked, not from the government of Burkina Faso, but from Israeli sources boasting of their pressure. Radio waves carried the story across the land. The Prime Minister of Israel has given Captain Traoré 48 hours to restore contracts or surrender. The reaction was volcanic. Crowds gathered outside the presidential palace, not to demand compliance, but to demand defiance. They carried signs that read, "Our minerals are not Israeli property." 48 hours? Try 48 years, and Traoré stays. Students filled squares. Market women raised their voices. Young men and women who had only known a life of uncertainty now roared for sovereignty. The chant thundered, "We are not a resource colony." By hour 30, Netanyahu called again, his tone mixing warning with persuasion. 18 hours remain. Your people do not need to suffer for your pride. But the president's answer was sharper than any ultimatum. Those crowds outside my window, they are not a shield. They are the storm. They are 22 million citizens who just learned you think you can choose their leader. As the clock ticked, pressure mounted on every front. Banking systems faltered under cyber assault. Power grids flickered. Communication lines jammed. Social media flooded with forgeries. Fake videos of officials resigning. Documents of phantom accounts. Whispers of flight. Yet the government fought back. Backup networks kept banks alive. Distributed generators lit the cities. Encrypted lines carried true messages. Every rumor was countered with exposure. The battle was no longer over one office. It was over the idea of African independence itself. And then something unexpected began. Calls came not from distant allies, but from nearby presidents. Mali's leader warned, if they can remove you, they can remove us. Niger's parliament condemned interference. Ghana's president called for an emergency African Union session. Chad's generals signaled readiness to defend sovereignty. What had begun as an ultimatum to one man was becoming a continental rallying cry. By hour 42, the transformation was complete. Across Africa, leaders who once hesitated now found their voices. Across the streets of Ouagadougou, citizens who once felt powerless now marched as one. The ultimatum was uniting where it was meant to divide. And at hour 45, Netanyahu called once more. His tone softened, almost pleading. Perhaps we can find a diplomatic solution. Your resignation may not be necessary if you restore our partnerships. But the reply was implacable. 3 hours ago, you might have had a negotiating partner. But you made two critical errors. You threatened to remove a democratically elected leader, and you underestimated the response of African democracy. The line fell silent. For the first time, the pressure seemed to shift back. The clock still ticked, but it no longer belonged to Tel Aviv. It belonged to Ouagadougou, to the crowds chanting below the palace, to a continent awakening to its own defiance. The deadline was approaching, and the question was no longer if Traoré would survive. It was how far the shockwaves of resistance would reach when the clock struck zero. The 48-hour deadline was more than a countdown. It was a stress test of a nation's foundations. And in those tense hours, Burkina Faso discovered not only its vulnerabilities, but also its hidden strengths. The attack struck first at the lifelines of daily life. Banking systems crashed as foreign algorithms flooded the networks. Power grids flickered, plunging districts into momentary blackouts. Social media became a battlefield of lies, where fabricated resignations and doctored bank statements spread faster than official denials. For ordinary citizens, the fear was tangible. Would salaries vanish overnight? Would the lights stay out? Would their leaders abandon them? But to the surprise of many, resilience emerged from the places long underestimated. Backup banking systems activated within minutes, ensuring essential transactions could continue. Small generators powered hospitals and key ministries, keeping the heartbeat of governance alive. Radio stations, trusted more than the digital fog, carried official messages directly to the people, bypassing the chaos of the internet. On the streets, what began as anxiety quickly hardened into resolve. Mothers clutching children shouted at the rumors of collapse. Our country is not for sale. University students organized neighborhood watch groups, countering misinformation in real time. Traders in the markets turned their stalls into discussion hubs, debating not whether to surrender but how to resist. A foreign ultimatum had paradoxically deepened national unity. The political effect was just as profound. Within Parliament, opposition voices that once criticized Traoré's bold reforms now stood behind him. We may argue about policies, one member admitted, but we do not argue about sovereignty. Regional leaders followed. Niger passed a resolution condemning foreign interference. Ghana's president pushed for an emergency African Union summit. Mali and Chad spoke of mutual defense. The ultimatum intended to isolate Traoré was instead stitching together solidarity across borders. This was not to say the risks had vanished. Economic disruption loomed large. Investment partners whispered of withdrawing capital. Aid programs threatened suspension. Diplomatic cables from Western capitals carried warnings of authoritarian drift and regional instability. Yet within Burkina Faso, the narrative was different. Citizens repeated a phrase heard in the streets: better hardship with dignity than comfort with chains. The psychology of the moment was transformative. For decades, many Africans had been taught that sovereignty was fragile, that small nations must bend to survive. But here was a living counterexample. The president did not flee. The government did not crumble. The people did not fracture. Instead, each attempt at destabilization seemed to strengthen the collective will. And with that came a broader question, whispered in homes and shouted in rallies. If one small landlocked nation could resist, what stopped others from doing the same? This is where the term entered history. Commentators abroad began calling it the Burkina Faso Revolution, not because a government had been overthrown, but because a mindset had been overturned. The revolution was not about streets in flames, but about dignity and defiance. For Traoré, the personal cost was immense. He slept little, carried the weight of possible collapse, and knew that behind every rumor of exile or betrayal, there might be a carefully laid trap. Yet in public appearances, he spoke with calm certainty. They believe power is measured in weapons and wealth. We measure it in loyalty and legitimacy. His words resonated because they echoed what people already felt in their bones. Sovereignty could not be rented out like a contract. By the third night, as the city of Ouagadougou braced for the final hours, the question was no longer whether the president would fall. It was whether an ultimatum had just forged a new national identity. The deadline was approaching, but the world was beginning to ask, had a coup been averted, or had a revolution already begun in the minds of millions? As the 48-hour clock wound down, the crisis in Ouagadougou had already spilled across borders. What began as a single ultimatum now rippled through diplomatic cables, editorial pages, and regional alliances. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency session. Delegates who once argued over minor disputes now spoke with one voice. If Burkina Faso is forced to its knees, warned Ghana's representative, then none of us can stand tall. Mali's leader was more direct. If they remove Traoré for defiance, they can remove any of us. The message was unmistakable. Sovereignty in West Africa was no longer a solitary struggle. It was a continental front. In Abuja and Accra, parliaments passed resolutions condemning interference. In Niamey, lawmakers declared that any attack on Burkina Faso's democracy would be treated as an attack on African democracy itself. Even in capitals far removed from the Sahel, a new determination was visible. The ultimatum intended to divide African states had, instead, united them. Across the oceans, reactions diverged sharply. Western outlets repeated familiar narratives: democratic backsliding, authoritarian strongman, dangerous precedent. Think tank reports warned of instability and the risks of turning away from established partners. Yet their words landed with less weight than before. Citizens in Africa had already seen images of their neighbors rallying, chanting for sovereignty, waving signs that mocked the ultimatum. Elsewhere, responses took a different tone. Caracas offered sanctuary. Tehran promised cyber protection. Moscow signaled military advisors. Beijing hinted at expanded economic ties. The message was consistent. If the West sought to punish, the rest of the world was ready to engage. In Washington and Brussels, policymakers debated quietly. Official statements emphasized concern and monitoring the situation. But behind closed doors, the anxiety was clear. What if Burkina Faso succeeded? What if defiance, once proven survivable, spread across the continent? It was then that international observers coined the phrase that would stick: the Burkina Faso Revolution. Not a revolution of guns, but of posture. Not a seizure of power, but a refusal to surrender it. To call it a coup of resistance would be too narrow. It was, in the eyes of the world, a moment when a small nation had turned the mirror on global power and said, "We too choose our own path." And as the final hours approached, the stage was set not only for a confrontation between a president and a foreign prime minister, but between two visions of international order, one where sovereignty is negotiable and another where dignity cannot be timed by a deadline. The world now waited for the strike of the clock. Would Burkina Faso stand, or would the ultimatum prove stronger than resistance? The deadline expired, yet the world did not witness collapse. Instead, it witnessed defiance turned into endurance. At the stroke of the 48th hour, Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the balcony of the presidential palace. Below him, a sea of citizens roared as he declared, "You are still free. Burkina Faso still belongs to its people." The ultimatum had ended, but the struggle for the future had only begun. What lay ahead was uncertain. On one side loomed the risk of isolation. Western capitals hinted at sanctions, investors considered withdrawal, and aid channels whispered of suspension. Disinformation campaigns continued, portraying resistance as recklessness, sovereignty as stubbornness. The threat of renewed destabilization was real. Yet on the other side, doors once closed began to open. Moscow and Beijing floated proposals for alternative investment. Caracas and Tehran promised continued assistance. Across Africa, leaders spoke of a shared defense mechanism, a Ouagadougou protocol that would bind nations against coercive diplomacy. For the first time in decades, sovereignty was not spoken of as a fragile relic, but as a living pact. At home, the transformation was even more profound. Citizens who once doubted their own power now marched with confidence. Young people began to speak not of leaving, but of staying. "If we can resist for 48 hours, one student said, we can build for 48 years. Farmers in the countryside told reporters that their crops felt different, not because the soil had changed, but because their dignity had. For Traoré, the path ahead was no easier than the ultimatum itself. The real battle was to turn resistance into resilience, defiance into development. He reminded his council, victory is not only refusing to kneel, it is proving we can stand on our own feet. The road stretched forward like an unpaved track into the horizon, rocky, uncertain, but illuminated by the first light of self-belief. It was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a long march where sovereignty was the compass and dignity the destination. The ultimatum had expired, but the true question lingered. Would Burkina Faso's stand remain a solitary spark, or would it ignite a fire across the continent that no foreign power could extinguish? When the dust of those 48 hours settled, Burkina Faso had not only survived an ultimatum, it had redefined the meaning of sovereignty. What began as a midnight threat turned into a dawn of dignity. The president remained, the democracy endured, and the people discovered that submission is not the only path. Resistance, when rooted in legitimacy, can be stronger than intimidation. The story resonated far beyond Ouagadougou. Across Africa, citizens whispered the same question. If one small nation could refuse, why not others? If Burkina Faso could face down a superpower, what stopped a continent from reclaiming its own voice? The Burkina Faso Revolution was not about changing leaders. It was about changing posture. It reminded millions that sovereignty is not a relic of independence days long past, but a living principle that demands defense in every generation. For Ibrahim Traoré, the stand against coercion became more than a political episode. It became a lesson written into the memory of Africa, a lesson that ultimatums expire, but dignity does not. The so-called Ibrahim Traoré coup was never about a fall from power. It was about a refusal to surrender it. And in that refusal, a new standard was set. African democracy could not be bought, timed, or dictated by external voices. 2 years later, when young Africans gathered at universities, they no longer spoke only of emigration or dependency. They spoke of building, resisting, and choosing. They studied the speeches of their leaders, but also the chants of their neighbors. Our minerals are not for sale. Our sovereignty is not negotiable. A new consciousness was forming, one that treated dignity not as a luxury, but as a necessity. This is why those 48 hours still echo. They echo in the halls of the African Union, where leaders debate defense protocols. They echo in the streets of Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, where citizens insist that democracy means people choose their leaders, not foreign powers. They echo in the quiet conviction of young Africans who know that their future will not be written elsewhere. If this story speaks to you, do not walk away. Subscribe, share, and let your voice join a movement that believes sovereignty is not just history, it is the future.